Germany, has a very large standing army anyway, is right in the van of the battle, if you like, in Europe. And to have them being slightly ambivalent might be the wrong word, but not being on the front foot here, I think has emboldened Putin very, very much. So now that the Germans seemed at last to have grasped that nettle, and 200 billion euros is a lot of money, then that is significant.
From The Times, it's the World in 10 podcast. I'm delighted to have Hamish de Bretton Gordon with me, a long-time British Army officer, chemical weapons specialist and defence commentator. Hamish, welcome. Sir Keir Starmer announcing spending will bump to 2.5% or 2.6% by one measure by 2027. Is that enough?
Well, we shall see if it's enough. I think it is very welcome. It sends a strong message to Moscow and the Kremlin and Putin. I'm sure when he looked west on the 24th of February 2022, he didn't see a conventional deterrence, and certainly not from the United Kingdom. I think it also sends a strong message to Kyiv and to President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine that Britain, quite apart from giving them some weapons and all the rest of it, are actually now prepared to make sure that their military is up to the threat of Putin and up to the ability to do something. And I suppose it might sound rather trite to say, most importantly, no doubt that this is aimed at President Trump, who Starmer is going to see on Thursday, who has been saying that countries like Britain and other European NATO countries need to spend a lot more. He said 5% on defence, and America will no longer underwrite or pay for our security. So in a whole host of ways, I think it's very welcome. Whether it's enough, the 3% in the next Parliament is probably closer to the area required, but also the additional money for the intelligence services, although it's only 1.1%, actually is pretty significant. And we punch way above our weight in the intelligence world. And if we want real leverage with the Americans and Trump, this is an area where even Trump will understand that they cannot afford not to have the Brits involved, because this is the stuff we're very good at. So it's a good start, I think.
Do you think this is just part of that dance to placate Donald Trump, as you say, Starmer heads for Washington? Or is this more a recognition that the post-Cold War security era is over?
Well, I hope it's more enduring. Now, I'm just a soldier. I don't necessarily understand the brilliant business issues that Trump deals with every day, and how he seems to run his new government. And I'm not a politician, so it does strike me. I realise, I'm a realist, that a lot of it is presentational for the visit to Washington this week. But I would hope also it's a bit more depth than that, realising that we have paid lip service to our defence since the end of the Cold War. And in a way that was fair enough. But the way that the threats have developed, particularly over the last 3 years, have shown that our conventional deterrence is just not up to the job. And you can't get defence on the cheap. And I think the Prime Minister has realised now that actually it is his number one priority, defence and security. It's no good being as green as can be and really cowtailing to everybody if, to use the vernacular, you've got the Reds at the door. And it's a realisation that we need a strong conventional defence. And, if there was a possibility that the Americans were going to leave us to it in Europe and not underwrite our defence, then, we have absolutely got to make sure that we can do it ourselves. So an awful lot's going on. There's obviously an awful lot of trickery and development before any plans are in concrete. But I think everybody has got what they want, hopefully, except for Putin.
Depending on who you listen to, this is between £6 and £14 billion a year. How much strong conventional defence could that buy the British armed forces? How much stronger will they be as a result of this?
Well, I think there are a number of things to look at, and the money is it sounds vast, but as you say, it's not vast. Not when you consider quite how expensive some of these capabilities are. But having said that, it's not insignificant. One thing that Britain has lost since the end of the Cold War is mass of manpower, mass of capability. And it's something that we have now learnt from the Ukraine war that you do need a bit of mass. So that hopefully will allow us to do that. We're also well aware that we've run down our stocks of ammunition in particular, and some of the smart military capabilities like Storm Shadow cruise missiles that have proved so effective. So purely refilling our ammunition bunkers and making sure we've got enough Storm Shadow and other capable missiles, making sure we've got enough air defence. Air defence is something that, when I was still in the army in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, air defence was not a big deal because it wasn't a big threat. It is now, and we don't have very much of it. So actually that, 4 to 6 billion per year for the next few years will allow us to regrow some capability. It's also very clear that the Ministry of Defence is pretty inefficient, and we've probably got a lot of stuff that we don't really need. And the Strategic Defence Review, again, we learned from Prime Minister today, we're going to get an update in a few months on what it's going to look at. And hopefully there is the opportunity to, get rid of some of the expensive capabilities we don't need. I think the very interesting thing that was not talked about today, but Macron has been talking about it, is on the nuclear side. It's predicated on the fact that if we can't rely on the Americans, is Europe going to have to rely on the British and the French nuclear capability to keep the Russians at bay? From a nuclear perspective, I think it probably is. But in a strange sort of way, it might be more efficient and more financially viable to look at our nuclear deterrent as a way of filling the gap rather than just pure numbers of tanks and soldiers and all the rest of it. So I think there's an awful lot here. But I think psychologically it is a very significant move today. Whether an extra 5 or 6 billion a year is going to push the dial when we look at pure materiel, tanks and aircraft, that's perhaps debatable. But the key thing is it's going in the right direction and hopefully sending out the right messages on both sides of the Atlantic.
Russia spends, by some measure, 6.7% of GDP. Donald Trump wants Europe to spend 5%. Do you see many more announcements like this from other NATO nations before they meet in June?
Well, today or yesterday we heard the Germans are potentially looking to spend 200 billion euros more on defence. Now that is hugely significant. I think a lot of us have thought that the Germans have failed to do the heavy lifting over the last 3 years in particular. And Germany, has a very large standing army anyway, is right in the van of the battle, if you like, in Europe. And to have them being slightly ambivalent might be the wrong word, but not being on the front foot here, I think has emboldened Putin very, very much. So now that the Germans seemed at last to have grasped that nettle, and 200 billion euros is a lot of money, then that is significant. But actually, when you look at what these various countries are actually spending on defence, Russia, spends 6 or so % on defence, but it's still a tiny amount compared to the Americans, and still it's only vaguely on par to what we spend. So, and the Russians are all about mass. We know they've had 1 million casualties and all the other bits and pieces as well. So I think one shouldn't be overly seduced by percentages of GDP, but I know politicians are, of course. But I get the feel from a soldier's perspective rather than a financier's or politician's that Trump's asked for 5% and he's got 3%. he tells us what a brilliant deal maker he is, and he'll probably say, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted.
Something politicians are worrying a little about is that perhaps Trump and his administration are less interested in defending Europe going forward. Poland's Prime Minister says he's coming to London to meet with Starmer and other leaders on Sunday. Germany putting together that 200 billion euro fund. Friedrich Merz saying we need independence from the US because the Americans, they don't care anymore. Was Starmer right to go to Parliament today and say NATO will continue to be the bedrock of our security?
I think he is, absolutely. But I also think, and he did mention in his speech in Parliament today, that there would be a new European alliance, military alliance. Now, whether he is suggesting there will be a sort of a European NATO alliance or something new, I'm not entirely sure. But I think it would be illogical and naive of European countries to discard America. I mean, the American power, military power, overmatches everybody else, significantly, including the Chinese, and way above the Russians. So I think that would be the wrong thing to do. And if we might not, have so many thousands of Americans sort of stationed in Europe, but really we still need their air power in particular, and their intelligence networks to back things up. And if the cost of that is for the rest of us to spend a bit more on our defence, and I think Trump's always said it, why should the American taxpayer pay to defend Europe and the UK? I mean, it's a fair point, but I don't. Again, I might be being naive, but I think I don't think Trump's looking to completely cut the UK and Europe off. He is far more inward-looking than perhaps his predecessors, and wants to spend money elsewhere, and probably, as importantly, wants to do deals and be seen to do deals. I think we will focus more on Europe, but I think we will discard the US probably. Something we want to avoid if at all possible.
As you say, those intelligence networks, the air support are crucial things, but what can we make of the US siding with North Korea, with Iran, with Russia? At the UN last night, on those resolutions that were condemning Russian aggression, we saw the US voting against Britain, against France, and the other countries that we would think of as the West.
Yeah, I mean, the UN vote yesterday is very difficult to understand. Again, what on earth did Trump think he would get advantage? He seems to be handing all the cards to Putin at this critical stage, and to not agree with the rest of the world that, it is Putin's fault. He is the aggressor. And to side with the axis of evil of Iran and North Korea. I mean, it seems bonkers. I mean, even the Chinese abstained. So maybe there is some brilliant move in there, but I just don't see it. And I think it has really, enraged Europe. Maybe we're going to see an about turn at the end of the week, and we'll all be praising Trump and all the rest of it. But these things, so many of these decisions have such a psychological impact, and people make decisions based on how they're feeling. It seems that decision would have been much warmly received in Moscow than it is in European capitals. So we shall wait to see, just how it unfolds. But one cannot, in any vestige, see why America would want to ally up and cozy up to the Russians rather than the Ukrainians. After all, the transactional deal that Trump seems to be offering to Ukraine is $600 billion worth of rare earth minerals, which again doesn't seem to be a very good deal from the Ukrainian perspective to me. But if that is what brings in the American military heft, then it's something one will have to consider, I expect.
Hamish de Bretton Gordon, thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.